Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 280. Arnold Resch. Arnold Resch featured in a breach of promise case in September 1925. Before the Marriage Act of 1961 in Australia, you could enact legal action for breach of promise to marry, that is, suing for calling off an engagement. Arnold Resch was 44 when this case was put forward. So who was Arnold Resch? Arnold Gottfried Resch was born in 1881 in Wilcannia, New South Wales, to Bernard Edmund Resch, who was born on the 9th of June 1847 in Prussia. Bernard arrived on the ship the Great Britain in 1863, reportedly to evade compulsory military service. He arrived with his brother Richard. He was a miner in Victoria and a succession of rural towns in New South Wales until the early 1870s, where he and a friend were the first to strike copper at the Cobar South Mine. After prospecting for a year between Cobar, Louth, Burke and Gilgandra, he went to Charters Towers in Queensland, where he built and operated the Cosmopolitan Hotel at Wellington Reef for 4 years. He sold out due to ill health, and in about 1877 he bought a cordial and aerated water factory at Wilcannia with his brother Richard. Bernard returned to Germany to marry Carolina Gottfried Resch on the 17th of October 1878 in Munich. They had 2 sons, Edmund Richard Emil Resch in 1879 and Arnold Gottfried Resch 2 years later. The cordial and aerated water factory flourished, as Wilcannia was a busy river port at this time and the centre of a vast pastoral district. It was known as the Queen City of the West, where most of the wool from northwestern New South Wales passed through the port. The town was also the centre of a number of coach routes, which traversed western New South Wales. In September 1879, Edmund and Richard branched out and opened the Lion Brewery. In 1883, they also purchased a brewery at Cootamundra. By 1885, they had branches of the brewery at Silverton, west of Broken Hill, and Tibooburra on the Mount Brown goldfield. On the 11th of August 1885, however, the partnership was dissolved by mutual consent, Richard carrying on the businesses at Cootamundra and Tibooburra, and Bernard continuing the business at Wilcannia, where he built up an enviable reputation as a skillful brewer. Bernard obtained his certificate of naturalisation in October 1889 when he was 42. In 1892 he retired to live in Melbourne. In 1895, though, he moved to Sydney to manage Olds Brewing and Wine and Spirit Company Limited for a banker who'd assisted him in his early business career. In 1897, Bernard purchased the brewery for £67,000 and in 1900 also acquired the rival business and plant of the New South Wales Lager Beer Brewing Company Limited, and it became known as Resch's Waverley Brewery. Now wealthy but uncultivated, they lived in great style at Swift's, a Gothic mansion on Darling Point, built by Sir Robert Lucas Tooth, and sailing on the Sydney Harbour was Bernard's chief recreation. His son, Edmund Resch Jr., eventually bequeathed Swifts to the Roman Catholic Church upon his death in 1963. In 1997, Swifts was acquired by the Moran family and, in what saved the home from a state of dereliction and possible destruction, it underwent a total restoration and renovation, and the Morans are still the current owners. The mansion is on the New South Wales State Heritage Register. In 1900, Bernard rebranded each company under the Resch's name. Assisted by John Alvarez, his accountant and manager, and his sons Edmund and Arnold, who'd both studied modern brewing techniques in Europe and in the US, Bernard embarked on a large building program, centralising his combined interests in Dowling Street, Redfern. In July 1906, Resch's Limited was incorporated with an authorised capital of £150,000. Bernard successfully advertised from 1904 to 1914 as brewer by appointment to His Excellency the Governor-General. His ales, beers and stout captured much of the New South Wales market. From 1903 to October 1913, Bernard was consul in Sydney for the Netherlands government and on his retirement in 1913 was appointed Knight of the Order of Orange-Nassau. Bernard was partially blinded after suffering an injury at sea while returning from a visit to Germany in 1913.
He'd returned to Germany for treatment and was there at the commencement of World War I, but fled after being threatened with internment by German authorities and returned to Australia. He financially supported the Australian war effort, contributing over £3,000 and topping up the military salaries of Resch's workers who enlisted, but was nonetheless interned in Holsworthy internment camp in 1917 at the behest of the Minister for Defence, George Pearce, one of a number of German businessmen to be targeted. Peter Monteith wrote a book called Captured Lives that featured a story of Edmund Resch, as he was known once he came to Australia, together with 40 other prisoners of war and civilian internees that were detained during the two world wars. And he said of Edmund that he was one of the older internees. He'd been living in Australia for a very long time. He was elderly and had contributed economically and brought new skills. So it was difficult to make a case that he was a genuine security threat. Edmund's loss of liberty was preceded by the circulation of malicious rumours about his loyalty, particularly in Union circles. Some people gave up drinking Resch's beer for the duration of the war. Edmund was hospitalised at Holsworthy due to poor health and was shifted to home internment at his Darling Point residence in March 1918, remaining there until the end of the war. It was reported during his internment that he'd been ill for 8 to 10 years and was living in retirement, and that his sons, Edmund and Arnold, had been conducting the business on his behalf. Edmund passed away on the 22nd of May 1923 at Darling Point, aged 76. On the 19th of June 1923, his probate was listed in the Armadale Express and New England General Advertiser. The late Edmund Resch, the well-known brewer who died a few weeks ago, left an estate valued at £316,829. In 1929, Resch's Waverley Brewery was taken over by Tooth and Company Limited in exchange for shares issued to the Resch family. Resch's Draft is one of the last of Sydney's 19th century beers that continues to be available from the bars of pubs in the harbour city. Resch's was taken over by Carlton and United Breweries, and Resch's Draft and Pilsner beer are still popular today. Edmund's wife, Carolina, passed away on the 3rd of August 1927 at Swifts, and she was 71. On the 25th of December 1927 in the Sydney Morning Herald in Wills and Bequests, probate has been granted of the will of the late Mrs. Caroline Resch of Swifts, Darling Point in Sydney, widow of Mr. Edmund Resch, brewer of Redfern, leaving an estate of £46,448, of which £12,150 represented realty and £17,550 voluntary distributions to her sons Edmund and Arnold Resch during the 3 years prior to her decease. She was 71 and appointed her husband, who predeceased her, and her 2 sons executors and trustees of her estate, the whole of which she left to her sons. And a little on his brother Richard Frederick Edward Nicholas Resch was born on the 25th of May 1851 in Berlin, Germany. He married Elizabeth Winter Cripps in Sydney on the 14th of July 1880. They had 7 children, 3 sons and 4 daughters. Richard continued with the Cootamundra and Tibooburra brewery businesses. He relocated to the Clarence River Brewery at Maclean. And Richard died on the 25th of May 1912 in Cootamundra, New South Wales at the age of 61. There was another brother, Emil, who served his apprenticeship in the brewing and malting trade in Germany and arrived in Australia on the 28th of September 1882. After a short time in Melbourne, he joined his brothers at Wilcannia and in 1885 took over their Lion Brewery at Silverton. In 1888, he opened a cordial factory in Broken Hill. He became an original trustee of the German Club at Broken Hill in 1892, and on the 15th of August 1893, in Germany, he married Emma Schwartz. He retained his brewing interests at Broken Hill, and in 1898 he went to Melbourne and became the general manager of the Melbourne Brewery and Distillery Limited, Victoria Brewery. He was naturalised in December 1899. In 1905, along with William Baillieu and Carl Pinshoff, he represented the Victoria and Carlton breweries and began discussions to form Carlton and United Breweries Proprietary Limited on the 8th of May 1907. He was general manager of Carlton and United from 1907 to 1914. And Emil died on the 17th of April 1930 at his Kew home, survived by his wife, one of his 2 sons, Carl, and his 5 daughters. His probate was sworn in at £30,254. On the 19th of June 1930 in the Sydney Morning Herald, the possession of about 50 articles of valuable diamond jewellery which belonged to the family of the late Mr. Resch was the subject of an equity suit between 2 of his sons. Mr. Arnold Resch of Belhaven, Bellevue Hill was the plaintiff, and Mr. Edmund Resch of the Swifts, Darling Point, was the defendant. The jury, it was stated, came from the late Mr. Resch. It included articles worth between £3,000 and £4,000, one of them being a diamond necklace worth £1,000. The plaintiff's claim set out that he and his brother, the defendant, were tenants in common in equal shares of a quantity of jewellery, which until its removal was kept locked in a box in the Sydney safe deposit, and to which the plaintiff and the defendant each had access. The plaintiff alleged that he had repeatedly requested his brother to agree to an equal division of the jewellery, having regard to the claims of either to such articles as might have a sentimental value, or in the alternative that it be submitted to public auction. The plaintiff complained that the defendant had refused to agree to this and had secretly caused the jewellery to be removed without the plaintiff's consent. The defendant disputed his brother's allegations and said that the jewellery had been removed in order that it might be in safe custody. His Honour, at the request of counsel for the plaintiff, adjourned the case to allow the parties to confer with a view of settlement. After counsel had conferred, it was announced the suit had been settled. By consent, His Honour made a decree for the division of the jewellery equally between the two brothers after a joint valuation by two expert jewellers, one to be nominated by the plaintiff and the other by the defendant. In the event of any dispute between such experts as to the value of any particular article, it is to be valued by the master in equity upon appointment, at which either party might attend, with the liberty to the master to call in expert evidence. The decree also directed that in dividing the articles, the master should portion the jewellery by beginning with the more valuable articles and by allotting each party one or more articles down the scale of value. The plaintiff to have the right of checking the jewellery with another expert of his own at the time of its production to the master for division, such time to be fixed by the master. His Honour congratulated the parties and said that he thought that they'd adopted a wise course in settling the suit. On the 8th of October 1930, so 4 months later, in the Brisbane Courier. From Sydney, family jewels of a value of several thousands of pounds were concerned in a suit brought by Arnold Resch against his brother Edmund Resch. In June, Mr Justice Long Innes made a decree ordering reference to the master in equity for an equitable division of the jewels. Experts were nominated by the parties to the suit, and today the master in equity decided to apportion the jewellery by dividing it, with the experts' assistance, into two equal parcels, beginning with the most valuable articles and working down the list of values. So now to the sons. Edmund Richard Emil Resch was born in 1879 in Wilcannia, and he married Florence Mabel Bennett in 1927 in Sydney when he was 48 and Florence 53. Florence had previously been married to Henry Triggs, who died in 1905, and Edmund died in 1963 in Wallara, New South Wales. On the 27th of July 1966 in the Canberra Times, Resch bequest ruled valid. In Sydney at the Equity Court, it ruled today that the bequest of more than $5 million to the Sisters of Charity by Edmund Richard Emil Resch was valid. Mr Resch, son of the founder of Resch's Brewery, died on the 2nd of October 1963, leaving an estate of $8 million. In his will, Mr Resch stipulated that 2/3 of the net income of his residuary estate was to go to the Sisters of Charity for 200 years, or for as long as they conduct St Vincent's Private Hospital in Darlinghurst. He directed the other 1/3 go to 4 charities: the Far West Children's Health Scheme, the Spastic Centre of Mossman, Boys Town, and the Royal New South Wales Institution for Deaf and Blind Children. On the 8th of June 1967 in the Canberra Times from Sydney, the Court of Appeal unanimously dismissed an appeal today by the executors of the $13 million estate that they be justified in briefing Sydney barristers to appear before the Privy Council. The appeal was made by the Perpetual Trustee Companies Limited, executors of the estate of the former brewer Edmund Richard Emil Resch. An appeal to the Privy Council in London has been lodged by a niece, Mrs Vera Caroline Lacrasse, of the Channel Islands, and 3 charities. On the 28th of June 1967 in the Canberra Times from London, 14 counsel, including 6 QCs, appeared before the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council yesterday. They will argue questions arising on the will and codicils of Mr Edmund Richard Emil Resch of Darling Point in Sydney. A wealthy former brewery owner, Mr Resch, died in 1963 at the age of 83, leaving a residuary estate of $8 million. The main question in the case turned on whether a bequest in the will of 2/3 of the income of the residuary estate to the Sisters of Charity for an 82-bed private hospital in Sydney was a valid charitable gift. Mrs Vera Caroline Lacrasse, a niece of Mr Resch, appealed for the judgment from the Supreme Court, finding that there was a valid bequest to the hospital. She contended it was not a gift for charitable purposes, and being accordingly undisposed of by the testator, passed to her as next of kin. So now back to Arnold to get an idea of how he ended up having a breach of promise case. Well, on the 16th of August 1925 in the Sydney Truth, there was an article titled "Sensational Breach of Promise Suit. French Beauty Claims £25,000 from Arnold Resch." The claim for £25,000 damages for alleged breach of promise brought by Madame Andre Vacher Lausanne against the well-known brewer Arnold G. Resch will be set down for hearing on September the 8th and will probably be the most sensational case heard in that jurisdiction in the history of the state. Madame Andre Vacher Lausanne, the vivacious lady who forms the central figure of the case, was born in Nemea and went to France to be educated at Bayonne near the Spanish border. Her grandmother was Spanish. Madame's father was one of the fine wine merchants in New Caledonia, and her mother still resides there. She was married at an early age of 17 years in her native land, but her married life was far from her girlish expectations. She divorced her husband for drunkenness and cruelty and came to Australia to start her life over again. She determined to become a businesswoman and entered into a partnership with another woman in a high-class robe-making establishment in the city. Her partner married and Madame abandoned the business. Shortly afterwards, she was placed in charge of Farmer and Company's designing department. Since she met Resch, she has visited the continent and returned through America. It is understood that whilst in the States, she received several lucrative business offers, but she decided to return to Australia. She's now in business for herself in the city and lives at Cremorne. A decided brunette with deep dark eyes, flashing white teeth, and two most attractive dimples, Madame speaks Spanish as fluently as her native French. The smart-frocking Madame has an air of distinction that's rarely associated with merely pretty women. She's medium height and slight, and there's a graceful poise about her carriage. Her walk suggests a strength of character unusual in any young woman as beautiful as she. Madame Lausanne is a woman who would be noticed in any gathering. Mr. Resch denies the promise of marriage and has briefed Mr. Shan QC and Mr. Sproul to conduct the case. Mr. Watt KC and Mr. Tucker have been retained by Mr. Hall, who is handling Madame's suit. It is expected that the hearing will provide one sensation on top of another. Letters are expected to play a most important part in the claim. Well-known society identities are expected to be heard in testimony from the witness box. The representative of big-moneyed interests and a household name throughout Australia on one side and a particularly beautiful and fascinating young French woman on the other, these in themselves would be sufficient to arouse public interest. So a little over a month later, in the Bathurst National Advocate, Madame Andre Vacher Lausanne is claiming £25,000, the largest yet made in the New South Wales court in a breach of promise suit. Again in the Bathurst National Advocate 2 days later, it outlines the second day of the case in Sydney. Another curious crowd composed mostly of women quickly filled the public galleries at the No. 3 jury court today when the hearing of the Lausanne-Resch breach of promise action was continued. Plaintiff is claiming £25,000 from Resch, who's a prominent city brewer. Madame said that after a trip to the south coast with Resch soon after her return from America, she had a meal with him at the Carlton Hotel. Mr. Sproul was there and Resch said to him, "Here she is, Mr. Sproul, I'm going to marry her." Madame said, "Don't be silly, we will see later." In reply to several letters from Resch while she was in Noumea, Madame wrote, "These letters are certainly the most cruel letters I've ever received in my life. What made you write this way? I don't know why you have chosen the hardest words you can to hurt me. Thank you very much for your good intentions, Arnold, but please don't send me any more money, neither put it in the bank for me. You seem to judge me as an adventuress by your letters. I don't want anything by pity or charity. Although I am poor, I can always live as long as I have by my health and my two hands." Madame said she returned from Noumea in the middle of March, and on the following day, Resch again proposed to her. He said, "No more trips alone for you. You are going to stay with me." According to Madame, Resch continued, "Andre, will you marry me? Your illness has been so long and my nerves were getting bad. We'll take up our story as it was before you went to hospital." I reminded him that he was carrying on with another woman while I was in hospital, and I did not believe his sincerity. He replied that he was getting old and he wanted me for a wife. I asked him when we would be married and he said it would be a private wedding after Easter. The next day he brought me a ring. It was his mother's and he said he hoped that I would be as good as wife to him as his mother had been to his father. Madame told of their first quarrel after this in her flat at Darlinghurst. On the wall was a picture of Bismarck, which she asked him to take down. He refused and she attempted to remove it, whereupon he slapped her in the face. The judge asked, "Did you slap him?" And the madam replied, "I cried." Madam said that on the 10th of April, Resch took her to the races and behaved in an impossible fashion, smiling at strange women and catching them by the arms. He raised his fingers at one of them, making the figures 463 his telephone number. On another occasion, when Madam was at the Hotel Australia, Resch's behaviour with a woman friend of his was absolutely terrible. Witness said she got up from the table where they were sitting and said, "You dirty little woman." To Resch she said, "You are the worst rotter in Sydney." Later, Witness asked Resch when they were going to get married, but he put her off in an indefinite reply. She asked him again and he told her he would give his answer on Monday. "On Monday," went on Madam, "I rang him up and he said I would never see him at my house again." "Is this your answer?" Madam asked. "What about your promise?" Resch swore at her. The plaintiff threatened to sue him for breach of promise, but Resch told her she would not be able to do that as it would cost too much money. She said, "Is this your last answer?" And he hung up in her ear. The witness admitted that after Resch had asked her to marry him, she was disgusted with him, but went to live with him. She denied that she'd written to a Sydney newspaper asking for it to take up her case. Mr. Shan cross-examined the madam at some length about her family connection, and he elicited the admission that she was born in EMEA. The witness further admitted that in none of the letters she had read was there a reference to a promise of marriage by Resch. Madam denied the suggestion she'd been given £3,000 by Resch. He had given her £5 or a £10 note on one or two occasions towards a dress. Then in the Sydney Evening News, Arnold Gottfried Resch, defendant in the big breach of promise case, entered the witness box this afternoon and told the story of how he met the plaintiff, Madame Luzanne. He introduced himself at the races, he said, and in 9 days' time she was his mistress. Resch stated that his father, who was a German, came to Australia at the age of 16 with 10 shillings in his pocket. Probate paper stated that Arnold was to receive £109,000. Ethel Burke, a young woman, was the first witness called by the plaintiff. She'd known Mr. Resch for 7 years and Madame Luzanne for 4 or 5 months. She met Mr. Resch one day and he introduced her to Madame Luzanne. That was after the latter's return from America. Mr. Resch said, "We're going to be married and in future all trips will be taken together." He said he would ring me and arrange for me and Madam to join him in a party in 2 or 3 weeks' time. On the Friday, Madam rang up and asked me to lunch on the Monday. On the Tuesday morning, Mr. Resch rang me and asked me to lunch. He said he'd quarrelled with Madam, and I said that I would come along, and I did, and we had lunch together. He told me that he and Madam had a very bitter quarrel, and all was over between them. I said, "I thought you told me you were going to get married," and he said, "No, that is all over now." She expressed surprise at the parting. He said, 3.5 years are too long to spend with any one woman. I want a change now." Subsequently, when he rang her up to go to lunch again, she told him she was disgusted with him regarding his treatment of Madam and that he had treated her in a very cruel way. He replied that she did not know the story. At lunch, he said that Madam was bringing a case against him and he did not know how, as he said she was poor. The witness then told him that the madam was broken-hearted, and he replied, "I don't think she's broken-hearted, she's running around with men." The witness said, "She doesn't appear that way to me," and Resch's answer was, "Oh, she's not a bad woman at all." The witness said she shared the profits of the business 50-50 with Madam. The witness said that her father had supported her for years. She had lived in a flat rented from Mr. Roos and had left without paying up the rent. She was sued and judgment was obtained and an execution levied on the furniture of the flat. She paid for the flat and received £4 a week from the business, and her father gave her money. She said that when she met Resch at the Washington Schools, he asked her how her daughter Betty was. She did not remember if she asked him how his child was. She knew he had a child he supported. The defendant said he was a brewer and employed in the family business of Resch & Co. He met the plaintiff at the races. She was with another woman. The woman smiled and he introduced himself. He took both women to dinner that night. On the Monday, they met again at the races, and 9 days after that, the plaintiff became his mistress. He took a flat for her and visited her frequently. She told him that she was 3/4 French and 1/4 Spanish. She came from Bayonne, she said. Her mother was living in France with her child. Her father, she told him, died when she was a little girl. She said her grandfather was a silk merchant and had married a poor girl in Spain, and that is how she became half Spanish. The defendant said that she had 3 brothers and 1 sister. One brother was killed in the war, another brother was in Paris, and another brother was running a wireless station in New Caledonia. Her sister had twin girls and married a French doctor who was killed in the war. She told me she'd married a man who was employed at the mines in Bayonne. However, at first she told me she was a widow. She said her husband fell in love with an actress who had gone through all of his money. He said he did not actually live at the house with the plaintiff. He said she was a very jealous woman, very bad-tempered, and from time to time there were disturbances. Up until the time she left, life was chiefly pleasant, he said. Madame Lazon said that she needed to do some buying for her designing company in Paris and was returning via America. Before she sailed, he bought her a dressing suit, 2 cabin trunks, a pillow and a few clothes. After knowing her for 11 days, and when she went to the flat, I paid her £40 and gave her spending money. While he was in hospital, his father, mother and brother came in unexpectedly. Madame was there and naturally he introduced her. His brother took no notice of her, but his father and mother said good day. Mr. Shand asked, did they know the conditions under which you were both living? And he said no. Describing how he came to discover that the plaintiff was a native of New Caledonia, the defendant said that the day that the plaintiff was to set sail, he went to her flat. I saw a small green book on the dressing table and I picked it up. She rushed at me and snatched it out of my hand. I asked her what it was and she said it was her passport. I said that if she did not show me her passport, I would not go to the boat to see her off. She let me see it and then I asked her why she had said she'd been born in France when her passport said that she had been born in New Caledonia. The plaintiff replied that it would not be good for her business if people knew she came from New Caledonia. He saw her in Melbourne before she sailed and she promised him that she would be faithful until her return, and he promised that he would go straight until she left the shores of Australia. She was quite satisfied with his limited promise, he said, and remarked that she understood it was quite different for a man from what it was for a woman. The defendant denied that at the Hotel Carlton he asked the plaintiff to marry him. He did not say, "You are the little woman I long for, I am going to be true to you." Nothing like that was said. She often spoke about Mr. Harrison of New York. She told me about him dozens of times, said the defendant. She told me that Harrison was largely interested in oil wells in Nova Scotia and that when coming through Halifax, she had seen the oil wells and remarked it was strange that afterwards I should meet Harrison. I subsequently found out there were no oil wells in Halifax. She told me that Harrison took her to a shop, showed her a fur priced at $500 and told her she could have it if she liked. She said she refused it, and also a wristlet watch. When she returned and they went on their trip to Kiama, he said he did not ask her to marry him. While Resch was giving his evidence, Madame sat behind, industriously taking notes. Every now and then she expressed a disapproval of what the defendant was saying. All the time that Madame was in hospital, did you ask her if she would marry you? He said no. Did you say to her, now is the time to get married? No. And did she say, if there is going to be a child, I will marry you? No. The defendant denied ever having expressed to the plaintiff a desire to have children. Then in the Wagga Wagga Daily Advertiser on the 1st of October 1925, it continues to outline the case, this time with Madame responding to questions. Mr. Shand asked her, do you remember meeting a German doctor in Paris? She said he was an American of German extraction. You went about with him a good deal, didn't you? Just as a friend. I suppose he was to take Resch's position. Oh no, not at all. Well, just to console you while you were away from Resch? And she said, now don't be nasty, Mr. Shand. Mr. Shand then asked her, why did you write this to Resch? I think I could have a very good time. There are very few ladies. I have made many sensations, especially the doctor. You're a baby compared to him. He is a real giant. But don't worry, I do not forget my promise. And she said she did that just to reassure him. So in the Adelaide News, it was announced from Sydney that after several days being occupied in hearing evidence in the case in which Arnold Resch, a wealthy brewer, was sued for £25,000 damages by Madame André Vacher-Lausanne, a French milliner and dressmaker, for alleged breach of promise of marriage, a settlement was effected today. Resch agreed to pay damages believed to be £20,000 in addition to her costs, which will amount to £2,000. After the settlement was announced, Madame declared that it had been her wish to fight out the case to the bitter end. Seen after the settlement, Madame appeared to be greatly excited. She declared, "Oh, it is terrible," throwing up her hands and shrugging her shoulders. You can tell the world that I know the jury was with me, she explained. I know I would have won. I know the people were with me. I have nothing to fear. I have told the truth. The intensity of the flash of Madame's dark eyes showed that this was no dramatic action. It is understood she received £2,000 damages and Mr. Resch paid all costs. Then on the 3rd of October 1925 in the Broken Hill Barrier Minor from Sydney, Madame Andre Lausanne was in better spirits yesterday following her success on Thursday in her breach of promise suit with Mr. Arnold G. Resch, the wealthy Sydney brewer. It is my intention to leave Australia for France, but I cannot say when. On my arrival in Paris, I mean to go to my hero, Napoleon, and place a wreath on his shrine to commemorate La France's victory in the Supreme Court of New South Wales. Just as Madame Lausanne was speaking of the victory, Mr. Resch drove slowly past in his motor car. Madame Lausanne turned towards him. He was also in good humour and smiled and winked at her. "Oh, did you see the wink?" said Madame enthusiastically. "I believe he is still in love with me. Before I leave Australia, I will probably go into pictures." Madame Lausanne said she was now satisfied that her counsel advised her correctly to settle her action. In the New Zealand Truth on the 10th of October 1925, the amours of a brewer. Was Resch's love all froth and bubble? Poignant missives of a French woman and a solid £2,000 damages for breach of promise. The story of the love of the enormously wealthy Sydney brewer, Arnold Resch, for the magnificent French brunette, Andre Vacher Lausanne, a love which, not reaching its culmination in marriage, cost the man £2,000, with a total cost amounting to £3,500. It is certain that Resch proved himself a connoisseur of beautiful and attractive femininity when he first became associated with Andre. Dark and handsome, with finely chiselled features and flashing brown eyes, she wears her clothes only a Frenchwoman can. She's born in Nemea, 35, but looks no more than 25. She's the mother of a girl of 16, a child of a marriage that was contracted at 17 that ended in divorce. As Madame Lausanne, an assumed name, she sought fortune in Sydney with a French genius for dress designing and was soon appointed at £10 a week at Farmers, where she worked until August 1923. She then met Arnold Resch at the races. It was love at first sight, and their association became very close. Then a breach occurred, and Andre found himself facing loneliness again. She had incurred great expense in preparing for the marriage and expended large sums of money, and had lost much time preparing, purchasing, and collecting suitable clothing and a trousseau. The courtroom was packed for the hearing. Andre appeared in a black hat and black dress fronted with red. Resch, a big man with strong features, seemed quite happy. He sat within a few feet of the lady on a long seat behind the bar table, close at hand to his advocates. Mr. Mack, one of Madame Lausanne's counsel, said that Resch is one of those types of men who crop up every now and again and have remarkable power over women. I do not say this offensively, but he's not an attractive man. Very shortly after they met, Arnold paid attention to her, and a week afterwards they had dinner with friends. He sent her flowers, tickets for the theatre, and showed her attention. Eventually, after they'd known each other for 5 or 6 weeks, he proposed to her, in which she accepted. However, Mr. Max said he proposed that she should become his mistress, but Resch acted in the same way as a man who's going to marry a woman. In fact, he even took her out and introduced her to his own mother. Eventually, the plaintiff went to France and was away from August 1923 to May 1924, during which time Resch wrote her many letters. In one quoted Mr. Mack, he said, "Poor kid, I feel sorry for you. I could go through hell. Even if you are 8 stone 10, it is not so bad for a cheeky little French froggy like you. You say you were sorry to say that you had to leave your position. Never mind which way it goes, the old firm still offers you your old position, which you like so." Then Mr. Max said, "Gentlemen, he says he does not mind her leaving Farmers. He says she can have her old position back as his mistress, but he has to keep her in good health, or she is no good to him as his plaything or his toy. She must be well dressed, and he must think of his own vanity. But when he gets tired of her, he does not offer her anything. She is done and flung aside." He then added that Mademoiselle paid for most of her fares. Arnold then wrote, "I thought you would make a hole in your £500. Don't be extravagant. Don't worry. You can always rely on a little financial assistance from Sydney when you are a good girl." Many of the letters the counsel described were too disgusting to read. On return via America, the plaintiff was offered a position of £20 a week, and Resch was provoked to write repeatedly for her to come back. He said, "Don't let uncertainties worry you. You have one certainty." He led her to believe that she was going to live with him for the rest of her life. He added, "I am taking a big responsibility, but I will care for you. I assure you there is no woman I have met during the past 8 months whom I care to make a pal of, so you see your old position is safer than ever." Mr. Mack then outlined that she came back in the middle of May 1924, and shortly after her arrival he took her for a trip on the south coast. Then when they were at Kiama he proposed to her. He was strong about it, protesting his love, but she did not accept him. Then, by the middle of August, they were still not engaged, and she was ill. It was necessary for her to have an operation, otherwise she could not have a child. And Mr. Mack, glancing at Resch in the court, said Resch was very anxious to have a child, and this was the strongest sign that he wanted to marry her. The first few weeks after her return, Resch was good to her. He brought her flowers, was kind to her. She took a long time to get over the operation, and it cost him a lot of money. So then he got tired of the whole thing, and said, "This is no good to me. I have no time for a sick woman." He began to make himself brutal. It took 3 months in hospital to recover, and then eventually she decided to leave Sydney for America. But on the 5th of March, Resch again proposed marriage. When Mr. Mack's address had concluded, there was a stir in the court as Madame left her seat and fluttered into the witness box with a charming, serene smile on her face. Her voice was hardly audible, and hearing was made more difficult by the fact that she spoke quickly with a very obvious French accent. She said, "Resch used to ring me once and sometimes twice a day. He sent me flowers and invitations to go to the theatre, and once coming from the theatre, he asked me, did I want to be his friend? I said no, that I did not do this sort of thing. Resch, she said, told her that he did not think of her that way, and he also informed her that he would not ask her to marry him as she was French and his father was German. And she said right up to the end I was never unfaithful to him. And from the time that I left my husband till I met this man, I never had anything to do with other men." In 1923 she became ill, and she found that Mr. Resch had a woman in her flat. After she came out of hospital, she decided she would go for a trip to Europe to see her mother, who was staying at Le Havre, and she left on the 20th of August 1923. She told Resch that she was going, and he allowed her £1 a day as long as she was away. He told me that he had a girl 15 years of age, and I told him what a shame, and he told me that he thought she was older. Madame was away for 9 months. She paid her own fare going, and Resch paid it coming back. Before returning, she wrote, "So if you feel you want me and I'm going back to Sydney, I would have to try David Jones or open a business of my own. Sweetheart, think a lot before letting me return. It is so very serious that I ask you to let me know. I promise I won't be jealous, so think a lot. Although I don't think about money, you are all that I have in the world. Dear Arnie, what a lovely man you are. You think about everything. You must have a good time now that you are free. I did not have the least flirtation since I left you. I had tons of opportunities. It would absolutely break my heart now if you had another girl, and I knew I could not have you. I miss you terribly." He wrote a letter to her in which he said it did not matter whether she stayed away for 6 or 12 months, but must get well. He sent her £50. A letter from him to her dated the 21st of October 1923 says, "You ask if I had a good time. Well, no, this sort of life is no damn good." She wrote back and said, "You are wonderful. Many thanks, my sweetheart, for the money order. So, my darling Arnold, you will love me and be true. My lovely darling, to think to send me some money. You have made me feel ashamed to accept all that. I will have to pay you back in love for that." On the 16th of October 1925, in the Armidale Express and New England General Advertiser, an Armidale visitor to the Sydney races says that the appearance of Madame Luzanne at Randwick one afternoon caused a sensation. Wherever she went, hundreds followed her. According to our informant, Madame seemed to enjoy the publicity. Then on the 4th of November 1925, in the Western Star and Roma Advertiser of Queensland, Madame Luzanne, while she was appearing in the action against Arnold Resch, got right into the limelight, for the moving picture men followed her up, and her picture, together with those of her lawyers and a number of members of the press, was shown nightly on the screen. The court proceedings evidently received full publicity in Europe, for Madame Luzanne has received an offer from Grammont, the picture producers of Paris, asking her if she'll accept an engagement. And sure enough, on the 3rd of November 1925, in the Wingham Chronicle and Manning River Observer in New South Wales, at the Arcadia Pictures, it features the Resch versus Madame Luzanne breach of promise case. And in the Hay Riverine Grazier on the 15th of December 1925, at the Majestic Pictures, the Resch and Madame Luzanne's breach of promise case. So only 3 months later, in the Murwillumbah Tweed Daily of New South Wales, it announced Arnold Resch married. Arnold Resch married to Brisbane girl. In Sydney, Arnold Resch, respondent in the famous breach of promise case brought by Madame Lazarne, was married today. Arnold Resch, 46, of Swift's Darling Point, with his best man, was on his way to be married at St Mark's Church. His best man was Mr Robert Sproul. Every care was taken to keep the ceremony a private one. A few guests, who included Mr Resch's brother, Mr Edward Resch, and his aunt, Miss Resch, were admitted by card, and the church was locked immediately after the bride arrived. The bride was Georgina Totty Dennis, known as Totty, the eldest daughter of the late Mr G. Dennis of Brisbane and Mrs G. Webb, and a stepdaughter of Mr Glenn Walsh, the one-time well-known Murwillumbah cricketer. She is 22 years old and looks very much younger. She was given away by her stepfather, Mr Webb. The responses from the bridegroom were almost inaudible, but the bride spoke clearly, although in a very low voice. Arnold and Toddy had a daughter, Vera Caroline, on the 8th of October 1934, and in the Bathurst National Advocate, on the 19th of June 1945, it announces the death of Arnold Resch. The well-known Australian brewer and businessman Arnold Resch has died in Germany after his removal from the Channel Islands by the Germans. He left Australia 9 years ago with his wife and child. There were no details of his death, but confirmation has been received from his wife in a letter to her sister in Sydney. The only definite news is that Resch died 3 years ago after the Germans occupied the Channel Islands. Mrs Resch has been held in the Isle of Jersey for 3 years with her mother and daughter. Vera Caroline will be 10 years old in October. The very wealthy and much publicised Arnold Resch left Australia with his lovely young wife and daughter to live on the Isle of Jersey. They were living there in idyllic surroundings when the Germans occupied the island. Mrs Resch and her mother and daughter are well. Mr E. Resch of Swift's Darling Point said today he'd not yet been informed of his brother's death. He had no communication from him for some years, he said. And a week later, on the 24th of June 1945, in the Sydney Truth, death ends romantic life of millionaire Resch. Until the islands were liberated, Mrs Resch and her 9-year-old daughter, Vera Caroline Resch, were held on the tiny island where the spacious Resch home was a showplace. Sydney relatives of Mrs Resch received occasional letters through the Red Cross during the 3 years of German domination. Some were censored, and then with dramatic suddenness, all reference to Resch were deleted from the letters. There was speculation on the fate of Arnold Resch, but the letters offered no solution. Recently, Mrs Georgina Brown of Darlinghurst, sister of Mrs Resch, was informed that her brother-in-law was dead. It was an obscure exit for the bulky, stolid and florid Arnold Resch, who a couple of decades ago was a name in Sydney as a man about town, first-nighter, entertainer, and blessed in a fortune of only Gestapo proportions. He's also remembered as a respondent in the celebrated breach of promise suit when his mistress, a dashing French divorcee, settled out of court for £2,000. Arnold Resch was intensely proud of his father, who founded the Resch Brewery. The Swifts landmark at Darling Point was the Resch homestead. It is still occupied by Mr Edmund Resch, who never aroused the publicity and the discussion that his brother achieved. Arnold attended the Church of England Grammar School, North Sydney, and Scotch College in Melbourne. He made the usual tour abroad of the wealthy man's son. It was the first of several jaunts before he left Australia for the last time. The fortune that was showered on Arnold Resch came from his father's beer and the great Australian thirst. However, he was virtually a non-drinker. He did not like beer, its taste, nor its effect on men. On February the 13th, 1926, the bachelor Arnold Resch married a pale, nervous Miss Georgina Totty Dennis at St Mark's Darling Point. The courtship was short. Miss Dennis was educated at St Gabriel's Convent in Waverley. She was a slight brunette with a love of dancing and smart clothes. Toddy and Arnold first attracted attention when they were seen together at a children's concert in the city. When she was a girl, Mrs Resch lived at Lismore, where her parents conducted a hotel. When her father died, her mother married again. Mrs Resch's mother, Mrs Webb, joined the family at the Isle of Jersey in 1939. When war broke out, she decided to remain with her daughter and son-in-law, and she too is said to be in good health. On the 20th of November 1951, in the Sydney Daily Mirror, Mrs Arnold Resch to wed again. In London, Mrs Arnold Resch of Jersey will marry Wing Commander Geoffrey Cooper, a retired Labor MP, on Saturday. The couple announced their engagement yesterday and will be married in the famous Grosvenor Chapel, where many society weddings take place. Cooper is 44 and Mrs Resch, who is a widow, is a little younger. An Australian Mrs Resch was formerly Miss Georgina Dennis, and she married Arnold Resch of the Sydney Brewer family in 1926. In 1936, they left Australia to live at Jersey in the Channel Islands, and Resch died during the Nazi occupation of the islands. Toddy died on the 24th of January 1997 in Jersey at the age of 91. Their daughter Vera was born on the 8th of October 1934 in Australia. She's featured on the 4th of August 1938 in the Sydney Sun with a portrait taken at a ball at St. Moritz in Switzerland when she was proclaimed the belle of the ball. And it says that Mr. and Mrs. Resch have been travelling in England and on the continent for the past 2 years and will be abroad for a further 12 months before returning to Sydney. On the 28th of June 1953 in the Sydney Sunday Herald, Sydney Girl has Mayfair debut. 18-year-old Miss Vera Resch, daughter of the late Mrs. Arnold Resch of Sydney and Mrs. G. Cooper, is the only Australian among Mayfair's coronation debutantes this year. Her coming-out dance was held at Londonderry House during the week. Mrs. Cooper says that although Vera was educated in England, she is keen to go back to see Australia, and we hope to visit Sydney by the end of the year. Vera married Philip Lacrasse, and she had 2 daughters with him, and she died on the 1st of December 2015 at St. Brelade in Jersey, aged 81. Toddy's granddaughter, Caroline, who married David Ling, ran the Blank Pignon farm. And there was a story online in regards to them, and it says it was the occupying forces who in part that contributed towards the establishment of one of now the largest dairy farms on the island. The story began in 1942 when the Germans were commandeering land across the island and attempted to add Toddy Resch's fields and 3 cows to their portfolio. Toddy, realising that 3 cows wouldn't be enough to prevent the takeover, quickly borrowed another 3 and pegged them out across the field, explains David Ling, whose wife Caroline is Toddy's granddaughter. When the Germans returned to claim the land, they were surprised to see the size of her herd. She asked the soldiers how she could continue to produce essential supplies of milk if she didn't have any land in which to graze her herd. The Germans were persuaded by her argument, and she and her original 3 cows remained, and the Blank Pignon dairy farm was born. A large part of the expansion of the farm was due to Toddy's daughter, Vera Lacrasse. She was a very prominent cow breeder and had a real eye for the animals. She loved farming and breeding, and it was largely down to her that the farm flourished. Vera was very well known in the farming community. On the day of her funeral, all the directors of the Jersey Milk Marketing Board paused their board meetings so they could attend the service. She was an amazing woman, and I hope she's looking down and smiling on the way the farm has developed. It was Vera's daughter Alice who kept the farm going for many years. She remains a joint owner of the farm alongside Caroline, who now lives in Australia, where she farms beef cattle. While she's in Jersey, she's very hands-on with the farm and started experimenting with ideas such as making gelato, which we're now fulfilling. And to finish off the story, who was Madame Andre Vacher-Lausanne? Well, she was Marie Albertine Therese Vacher, who was born on the 20th of February 1890 at La Foa in New Caledonia. She initially told Arnold she was 3/4 French and 1/4 Spanish and came from Bayonne, and she said her mother was Spanish. She said her father was one of the first wine merchants in New Caledonia and said that her mother still lived there. But then she told the courts her parents were French. She said she'd lived for 10 years in France, then went to Noumea, then she married a mineralogist who divorced her, and the practice in France was if the husband divorced his wife, the latter after 3 months resumed her maiden name, but she did not like the name of Vacher and adopted that of her aunt, Lausanne. When questioned in court, she also said that her father's name was Vacher, and he died when she was 5 years of age, and her mother, under the name of Madame Vacher, was a school teacher in Noumea and returned 15 years ago. She'd given Lausanne to Resch as her mother's name for reasons of her own, and she did not wish him to communicate with her family and disclose the relationship that existed between them. Then when she was further questioned in court, she was asked, "Your mother's name was Huguini. Will you swear she was not of that name?" She said it was not. "Did you know that she was married to a man named Huguini? My mother has no right to be dragged into this court." "How long have you lived in New Caledonia?" She said, "Since I was 7. "Were you educated at the convent and state school at Noumea?" "Not altogether," she said. "Did you tell Resch your husband had been carrying on with a woman?" She said yes, "and that you carried on with a man and were sorry the case had led to divorce?" "No, never." "Your husband got a divorce against you?" "Yes." "You were requested to return to him and you refused?" "Yes. I left my husband about 14 days. It was all arranged between us." So family trees have the possibility that Madame Lausanne's mother was Marie Louise Caroline Vacher, He was born on the 18th of February 1859 at Toulon in France and died on the 4th of June 1934 in Nemea. Marie Varcher did marry a Pierre Nicolas Huguini on the 2nd of February 1875. He'd been born in France on the 19th of August 1840 at Chamois, Champagne, France, and he died on the 21st of February 1889 at Nemea. He was a military surveillant. She told Anna that she was married when she was 17, and I did in fact find a record that states that Marie Albertine Thérèse Paula Varcher married a Frenchman, Vincent Leon Fricot, on the 3rd of April 1907. He was 10 years older than her and was born at New Caledonia. Vincent was connected with coal mines near Bayonne. Remember, she initially told Arnold she was a widow, but she was in fact divorced. They did have a daughter, Raymond, in 1909 in New Caledonia. On the 26th of March 1926 in the Murwillumbah Tweed Daily. Not afraid of number 13. Madame Luzanne, whose breach of promise suit against Arnold Resch was one of the sensations of the year, is reported to be engaged to a very wealthy Queensland squatter, a widower. She's resigned from her position with a wholesale firm in the city and is frequently seen in the streets in her smart motor coupe with a striking number 13 mascot on the bonnet on shopping expeditions. There are few women who would deliberately choose number 13 as a mascot for a car in which to collect their trousseau. But then, according to a story which Madame told some time ago, the devil's numbers followed her throughout her life with peculiar persistence. Her baby was born on the 13th of the month. She arrived in Australia on the 13th of the month. Arnold Resch's birthday was on the 13th. She'd known him for 13 months when they parted. The numerals in his telephone number added up to 13. She left Australia on a trip abroad on the 13th in a cabin number 13 and arrived back in Sydney on the 13th. Her new telephone number again added to 13. She and Resch dissolved their partnership on the 13th of the month. "Oh, how that number has followed me," she said when telling the story. She purchased the smart little car, which she's now driving on the 13th, hence the mascot. And in the Brisbane Truth, Madam and Matrimony, Resch's late sweetheart to wed. Will rich Queensland squatter be her husband? Now that the sensation created by the marriage of Arnold Resch is simmering down, comes the news that his erstwhile sweetheart, Madame Andre Varcher Luzanne, is to be married within the next few weeks to a wealthy Queensland squatter. Rumour has it that the marriage will take place in a registry office, that apparently being Madame's wish, in Sydney or Rockhampton. It is that Madame has chosen as her new life's mate a man very similar to Resch in appearance. Big men with fair hair and blue eyes seem to find favour with the dark little Madame of the sparkling eyes and alluring accent. It is also said that the big Queenslander has a banking account, which, while not quite as large as that of the rich brewer Resch, is certainly a substantial one. Madame and her squatter are to leave for a trip abroad at about the end of April. Madame is severing her connection with a large wholesale establishment in York Street, where she's been employed for some time since her legal fight with Resch. Born in Nemea 38 years ago, she was married at the age of 17 to a Frenchman named Tricolet, and there was a daughter from the marriage, Raymond, who is 16 years of age. Andre's first plunge in the matrimonial sea was not a refreshing one. She soon realised her husband was far from ideal, and so taking little Raymond with her, she left him. He divorced her on the grounds of constructive desertion, and she came to Sydney. Madame is at present enjoying a quiet holiday at Mossvale, apparently forgetting the worries of business, in preparation for her union with the big fair-haired Queenslander. So 8 months later, doesn't mention anything about a marriage, but on the 28th of March 1926 in the Sydney Truth, it says Madame Andre Luzanne visited the Truth office during the week and denied very firmly the allegations made by Solicitor Tucker in his affidavit to the Registrar in Bankruptcy that she still owed him any money for his services as counsel in her action against Arnold Resch for a breach of promise. And then on the 13th of June 1941 in the Le Courrier Australien of Sydney, that a grand scheme's been brought into operation by Madame Andre MacDonald. Madame Andre has opened a shilling-a-week fund in cooperation with the Comforts Fund Committee. This enables the donor in their share in proving to the soldiers and sailors of Free France that their families in New Caledonia and Tahiti are not forgotten. Madame Andre tells me that nearly all of her subscribers are ladies. You can enrol yourselves as members by writing to Madame Andre, Albany Court, Collins Street, Melbourne. So I'm not sure whether this is the same lady that is referred to in 1930 and 1941 and whether she did in fact marry a wealthy grazier with the surname of MacDonald in Queensland. So I hope you enjoyed the story of Arnold Resch and Madame Lausanne.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.